All right, this is Ubedo on behalf of V Electronics, and in this video, we're going to talk about sources of government borrowing. Okay, now when the economy goes down, when you have a recession, when unemployment goes up, governments borrow and spend money. When they borrow money, you have different sources where the government borrows money from. Okay, the first one of these sources would be the general public or the households within a nation. So we're talking about households. Okay, and you may ask how the government borrows money from households. So basically, the households will go ahead and invest money in the bank. So households invest money in the bank. Households invest money in the bank. And because these households invest money in the bank, what's going to end up happening is the bank will go ahead and sell instruments, financial instruments. Okay, so the bank will go ahead and buy and sell financial instruments. Will buy and sell financial instruments. Okay, such as treasury bonds. And this would be from the government. So if the bank goes ahead and buys treasury bonds from the government, okay, the government will receive the money from the treasury bonds and will use it for its operation. Okay, so this is treasury bonds. So when governments receive money, okay, they will fund their own operations. Okay, so governments they sell treasury bonds, for example. Okay, and basically it will fund their operations. This is how they make their money. All right. Now, the second source of government borrowing, this is technically money being borrowed. Okay, so the second source of government borrowing is when private firms borrow less. So private firms, you have private firms that borrow less. And when we talk about private firms borrowing less, essentially what we're talking about over here is firms borrowing less money for capital expenditure. Okay, so firms borrowing less money. This is borrowing less money. Okay, so firms they borrow less money. Okay, and when firms borrow less money, what's going to end up happening is the governments they will invest more money to stimulate the economy. So we've talked about private firms and capital expenditure, how capital expenditure increases your GDP, stimulates the economy. So when the firms they borrow less money, okay, governments in general, they will borrow and spend more money. So they will borrow and spend more money. Spend money on infrastructure. Okay, and we've talked about this kind of borrowing as well, where the state and local governments may borrow from the federal government. Okay, when the federal government gives out grants, okay, you have the state and local governments investing those grants in public infrastructure like hospitals, okay, so on and so forth when it comes to pandemics. Okay, so this is public infrastructure. And the third one has to do with additional borrowing outside the country. So this is additional borrowing outside the country. All right, so when the government goes ahead and borrows money from outside the country, we're talking about money from investors. Okay, so if the government sells bonds, okay, may sell bonds to both domestic and okay, international investors. Okay, so when international investors they buy bonds, okay, when they buy government bonds, for example, they become a source of funding for the government. Become a source of funding. They become a source of funding for the government. For the government. All right. So again, number one is households. Number two is private firms that borrow less, and number three is additional borrowing outside the country. So these are three sources of government borrowing. And that would be it for this video. On behalf of B Electronics, this is Obey. Have yourself a great day.